Hi, everyone. Marcos Colon here, Director of Digital Community and Content Development at Cyber Risk Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us for another installment of SC Media's In Focus. I'm really happy to be joined today by Maurits Lucas, Director of Intelligence Solutions at Intel 471. Maurits, thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And today we're going to be discussing the biggest threat that organizations face, both large and small, and that's ransomware. Some of the studies predict that ransomware damages are going to reach into the billions this year. I think the number was 20 billion, although that study came out a while back. But attackers do like to go after larger, more profitable targets. But thanks to what we've discussed before, Maurits, the business of ransomware, right? It's becoming easier for attackers to leverage this tactic. So smaller organizations really aren't immune. And today I want to dig into this topic with you since you have incredible insight. So ransomware has been a constant threat for organizations. We know that at any size. So what are you and your team seeing right now from that security professionals that are tuning in really should keep top of mind?
Well, we see some of the more sophisticated actors in the underground starting to take a keen interest in supply chain attacks. Of course, supply chain attacks have been in the news quite recently with the SolarWinds incident. But if you look at the coverage of that, you get the idea that that type of attack is the sole preserve of nation states. But actually, in some ways, nation state actors were beaten to this attack by financially motivated actors. We've seen attacks in previous years where cyber criminals compromised third-party suppliers such as MSSPs, ISPs, telcos, hosters, and suppliers of niche software products to specific verticals, but also things like IoT devices and using that to gain access to a network. Interestingly, back in November of 2017, we observed an actor who was going by the name of FXMSP offering access to SolarWinds for sale. And that's a full 3 years before the current incident that's been in the news. Now, we've got no reason to believe currently that those incidents were in any way related, but it shows how financially motivated actors were there before APT29 allegedly was. FXMSP, by the way, later on became very notorious when he offered access for sale to no less than 3 AV companies. But recently, we've seen more instances where actors are offering access for sale to a very large list of potential victims. And then when pressed about it, will actually say, well, that's because we've compromised a third-party supplier to those victims. We saw 2 very reputable and mature actors actually asking for others to approach them whenever they had access to or any type of access that could be used for supply chain attack, because they'd be very interested in acquiring that type of access. One of them was interested in access to source code or source code repositories. The second one was asking people to come to him whenever they had access to cloud service providers, hosters, and other IT service providers. So from that, basically, we see actors becoming more and more interested in this type of attack. Also, because, of course, it allows them to kind of breach more victims much quicker and for less effort.
And to that point, attackers tend to take the if it's not broke, don't fix it approach to their tactics. Ransomware, since it's been so successful for time and time again, it's going to continue to be used. Is it from your standpoint, from the research that you and your team have done, and from what you've seen, is it fair to say that it's really not going to go anywhere?
I think it seems like for the foreseeable future, it's here to stay. And as you said, one of the reasons is it's such an attractive quote unquote business model for actors. It's very profitable. The attack itself is profitable, but it also is a good fit for many types of potential victims. There are several steps in a successful ransomware attack, and you can divide that labor up into distinct chunks and then assign that to different actors. So that allows each of those actors to specialize in their particular role that they play in that bigger picture. And so you divide up the labor. You split the proceeds amongst the various parties, and those parties can specialize in one little subject, become much more effective and much more efficient at it, meaning they can do more of it for the same amount of effort. And that basically increases the effectiveness and the efficiency of the whole operation. So it scales, and that means that everybody who's involved with it gets to earn more money for the same amount of effort. And that is a very attractive, that's just a very attractive way to do things for them.
If you can dig into that just a little bit deeper, the cyber criminal sort of underground, there's an economy there as well. It's very organized, it's very efficient, and it makes leveraging a lot of these attacks, even beyond ransomware, a lot more attractive. So can you discuss what that business of ransomware looks like and how threat actors collaborate and operate in that space?
You're exactly right in saying that the cyber underground, basically, it mirrors the above ground. That's kind of an economy and business models, and the same rules that apply above ground apply underground. For the kind of the surge in ransomware attacks, there are two factors that are driving that, or two key elements: the sale of network access in the underground, which has taken off, but also the appearance of so-called ransomware as a service operation. So to kind of understand that the economy or the business model around ransomware, we can take a look at both of those in a bit more detail. And we'll start with ransomware as a service. So the idea behind ransomware as a service is that that service has operators, and those operators actually only deliver the tooling and the infrastructure. They leave the hard work of conducting the actual ransomware attacks to others. They're so-called affiliates. Now, the affiliate's job is to basically deliver the victim. So they have to somehow gain access to the network of a potential victim. They then have to map out that network, identify any key assets that will be encrypted, disable or poison the backups. That's a key step to make recovery more difficult. That helps to convince the victim to pay up. Exfiltrate a large amount of data. That's a backup threat. If you don't want to pay for recovery, well, pay us because we won't. Otherwise, we'll publicize your data. And finally, they will deploy the actual ransomware in a coordinated manner onto all those resources they defined as holding that key data, those key assets. Now, the operators, the ransomware as a service operators, they're responsible for building the software and the supporting infrastructure, maintaining the website where that leaked data is published so that the press can easily find it, because that increases the pressure on victims. And they conduct the negotiations with the victims. In the end, they collect the ransom in Bitcoin. The operators then take their cut. Typically, that's between 20 to 30%. And the rest of the remainder of the ransom they pay to the affiliate. After all, the affiliate did most of the hard work. Now, to kickstart this whole process, the affiliates need network access to victims, but they don't go around doing that themselves. They have enough to do. They maintain relations or work with other partners or actors that sell network access. So those actors are actually specialized in just that one bit, obtaining access and selling it. They do that by running botnets, which steal usernames and passwords. They either brute force legitimate remote access functionality for an organization, for instance, VPN servers, Citrix servers, remote desktop protocol, etc. Everything your remote workers use to access corporate resources. They also sometimes often work to, if there's any vulnerabilities in those types of solutions, they work to exploit them. So any vulnerabilities in VPN products, Citrix or RDP are really jumped on by the underground straight away. Now, those are kind of the main steps in a ransomware attack. And each of those steps is performed by an actor or a group of actors. And they've specialized in that step. They specialize in being the best at that particular step. But they collaborate in the end so that each of them eventually gets their share of the ransom that the victim pays out. It's also interesting to note that these ransomware as a service operations kind of work as brands with a corresponding reputation. If a victim is hit with a ransomware family that's well known, there's a lot of information out there on previous attacks, that will quickly help or make the victim realize that A, there's no way around the encryption, and B, which means that paying is the only way to get your data back. But B, if you do pay, the criminals will be true to their word and give you the decryption key and not leak your data. And from that perspective, also note that for a well-known ransomware as a service operation, that brand is there and their reputation is very important to them. So it's in their best interest to uphold any deal they strike with a victim, because if they don't, their reputation suffers, and then future victims will be less inclined to pay. So by reneging on the deal, they're basically slaughtering the goose that lays the golden eggs. Now, of course, executing the whole attack is just one step. The next is to actually make the victim pay. And that's where we see lots of techniques being used to help victims pay up. Leaking the data, that's an additional threat that they added, just to kind of help encourage you to pay up. If you were able to say, well, listen, the fact that my data is encrypted doesn't bother me, then they say, well, maybe the fact that it's going to be published will. A final thing to note is that late last year, one of the operators behind Revil ransomware, or REvil, I should say, gave an interview to a Russian security researcher, and that interview is on YouTube. And in that interview, the actor shared some behind-the-scenes insights that, on the one hand, of course, we have to take with the requisite grain of salt, about a metric ton should do. But at the same time, it does align rather neatly with what we've been able to observe in the underground. So one of the things and talk about a brand, he explained how to actually pronounce the name. It's pronounced REvil because it's based on the movie title Resident Evil. They play on it. This is ransomware evil. The actor said the core group of operators was just 10 people. They take between 20 and 30% off of a ransom, but they turned over more than $100 million a year. The info-stealing malware and exploits were actually the best source of access. Exfiltration of data, he said, the actor said, was more important than actual encryption. So that threat of exposing seems to be the main motivation getting people to pay up. And the final one, 1 in 3 victims end up paying up. So that's kind of some of the moving parts around the economy and the bits of in the underground around ransomware attacks.
Obviously, security professionals and IT organizations are facing, some smart individuals on that side that have their stuff together. What are some common mistakes that you've seen them making, considering you're constantly out there speaking to some of your customers, doing research independently, I'm sure as well. What is it that they should be doing and focusing on?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to some of what you would call common mistakes, there are 2 that I'd like to kind of draw the attention to. I think the first thing is that you see people thinking is it won't happen to me. And in the past, I think when you look at general activity from cyber criminals, interestingly enough, in the past, you'd mostly be right, certainly for large scale or very high impact attacks. And the reason is that before ransomware attacks, actors were actually targeting mostly a very narrow band of victims. A very specific set of circumstances had to be met before you would be in their crosshairs. So think about targeting, they were aiming at online banking customers, retail banking, or they were looking at wholesale banking customers. So trying to find a PC within organizations that is used to submit payments and then kind of get it to submit additional payments. Later, they started targeting banks themselves. We read about the Swift gateway attacks, for instance. But there's a problem from the attacker's perspective with those attacks. And that's exactly the narrowness of their applicability. They only worked under very specific circumstances. And sometimes you couldn't really determine whether those circumstances were met before you started your attack on a particular victim. You'd spend a lot of effort only to figure out, this doesn't work here. So ransomware was actually specifically designed to solve that problem. So in the past, as an organization, if you were looking at the issue and thinking about who is ever going to be interested in me, some would say, well, no one would want to buy our data, so who would want to steal it in the first place? Well, there's a flaw in that reasoning, because there is always at least one buyer of your data, and that's you. And that's exactly what ransomware attacks do. They lock you out of your own data and get you to buy it back. They basically already know they have a customer for the data. It's you. And that approach works on almost any organization, because your data, basically an organization's data, is always valuable to that organization itself. I think a second common mistake is to focus on the ransomware itself. As I think it became clear during the earlier questions, there are actually many steps in a successful attack, and the deployment of the ransomware is the last step. So would it not make more sense to try and stop or thwart the attack earlier in that sequence of steps, instead of waiting until the last possible moment to either save the day or fail and be in a lot of trouble? So focus on how they obtain that initial access, and also ensure that you can spot that affiliate trying to move laterally through the network. And kind of as an extension of that, don't discount what others may say are simple threats. For instance, that info stealing malware, it's sometimes thought of as very crude malware, very simple and a simple threat. But as we can see from those simple beginnings, big impacts can grow.
Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. I want to thank Maurits Lucas, Director of Intelligence Solutions at Intel 471. Maurits, thank you for being in focus with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.